He walked through those doors like the room owed him something. And every single person at that Thanksgiving table stopped breathing. I heard Serena's wine glass connect with the table. Not placed, landed. The way your hand loses grip when your brain suddenly needs all available power somewhere else. I heard Marguerite's chair scrape back an inch, involuntary, the body's honest response to something it recognizes as danger before the mind catches up. I heard Elliot, composed, polished, never lets the Elliot, make a sound in the back of his throat that I had never once heard him make in 4 years of marriage. Something between a question and a prayer. Because Rafael Veti had just walked into his family's Thanksgiving dinner. And Rafael Veti was not looking at Elliot. He wasn't looking at the table or the candles or Serena in her carefully chosen ivory, or Vincent Vance at the head of it all with his old money and his older certainties. He didn't scan the room the way people do when they're looking for someone. He didn't need to scan. He moved through the doorway, dark suit, silver at his temples, the kind of stillness that belongs to men who have never once been rushed by anything or anyone, and he found me. Across a room full of people who had spent the last 2 hours deciding I didn't belong there. He found me like I was the only fixed point in the room. And he walked toward me. Not fast. Not slow. With the absolute unhurried certainty of a man who has never been stopped by anything in his life and did not intend to start tonight. The table watched him come. I watched him come. And I felt, for the first time since I had rung that doorbell and walked into this house that used to be mine and sat down at this table that had been arranged to make me feel small. I felt the thing I had spent 2 years quietly, carefully, painstakingly rebuilding inside myself. I felt like myself. He stopped beside my chair. Both hands came up, unhurried, certain, the hands of a man who knows exactly what belongs to him, and he cupped my face. His forehead came down to meet mine. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the candles. Then he said it. 2 words. My wife. Serena's chair scraped the floor again. Someone, I didn't look to see who, let out a breath that was almost a word. And Elliot Vance, the man who had sat at the head of his family's table all evening with the quiet authority of someone who had never once been wrong about anything. Elliot Vance went absolutely still. Like a man watching the ground shift under everything he thought he knew. He had left me 2 years ago because he said I was too quiet for his world. He had no idea whose world I'd been building in the silence. If your heart is already racing, good. That means you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Stay right there and hit that subscribe button, because what this room finds out next, about who Rafael Veti is and who I became while Elliot wasn't watching, is everything. Let's go back to the beginning. The Vance estate smelled the way it always had. Old wood, good wine, and the particular confidence of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged somewhere. I knew every hallway. I knew which third stair creaked, which guest bathroom had the broken towel hook, where Eleanor kept the extra candles when the dining room ones burned low. 2 years away and the house remembered me even if the people inside it had decided not to. Eleanor found me before I had made it 10 steps past the entrance. She came across the foyer the way she always moved, with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has earned the right to take up space, and she pulled me into her arms without a word of preamble. She smelled like vanilla and something floral, and the embrace was so unguarded, so entirely without agenda, that it almost broke something open in my chest that I had spent 2 years carefully sealing shut. You came, she said quietly against my temple. Yes, I answered. She pulled back and held my face in both hands. Weathered hands, warm hands, the kind that had kneaded bread and held grandchildren and probably held Elliot accountable in ways no one else ever had. And she looked at me the way she always had. Like she saw something the rest of the family had been too busy to notice. You look beautiful, she said. Eleanor. I shook my head slightly. I mean it. She squeezed once, then released me. Come. They're all in the sitting room. I followed her through the hallway I knew by heart, past the gallery of Vance family photographs that lined the left wall. Elliot at various ages, his sister Philippa at her graduation, Vincent Vance accepting some civic award with the expression of a man being given something he always expected. I had walked past these photographs hundreds of times when I was a part of this family. I walked past them now like a visitor studying art in a gallery that had recently reacquired pieces it had once traded away. The sitting room was full. Elliot's aunt, Marguerite, stood near the fireplace with a glass of red wine and the expression of someone who had already been briefed. His cousin Freddie sat on the arm of a chair talking too loudly about something that had happened at a conference. Vincent Vance, patriarch, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, stood at the far end of the room with the posture of a man conducting an invisible orchestra. And Serena had positioned herself at the center of it all, wearing ivory and that particular smile, already pouring warmth over the room like it was something she'd prepared in advance. He saw me come in. The smile didn't waver. If anything, it softened, deliberately, visibly, into something that looked almost like compassion. "Everyone," she announced in the bright voice of a woman who had decided she was already the hostess. "Prudence is here." The room turned. I watched it happen. The small recalibrations, the reassembled expressions, the particular social adjustment of people deciding in real time how to treat someone they'd been told a story about. Marguerite's smile was thin. Freddie gave a short nod, then looked away. Vincent Vance's gaze traveled over me the way it traveled over quarterly projections, looking for the line that explained underperformance. Elliot emerged from a side doorway. He saw me and stopped. Something moved across his face too quickly to name. Surprise, recalculation, and underneath both of those, the faintest trace of something that might have been guilt, if Elliot had ever learned to sit still long enough to feel it. "Prudence," he said. "Elliot." I kept my voice even and light, the way you keep a door from swinging all the way open. "Happy Thanksgiving." He crossed the room toward me and I noticed, the way I had learned to notice everything in the past 2 years, cataloging rather than feeling, that he did not introduce me to Serena. Serena introduced herself. "I've been so looking forward to meeting you," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who wanted you to know she wasn't afraid of you. "Elliot speaks of you warmly." He did not correct her. I shook her hand, smiled and said that's kind of him and left it exactly there with no embellishment, no reciprocation, no invitation for her to continue the performance. The room settled. Drinks were offered. I accepted water. Marguerite said something about the drive up and whether I'd had trouble with traffic, and the conversation moved on the way conversations do at family gatherings, in circles around the furniture of people's real feelings, touching nothing directly. I stood in the middle of it and breathed. I was here for Eleanor. I told myself that again, quietly, in the part of my mind that had become very good at steady narration over the past 2 years. You are here for Eleanor. You will get through this dinner. You will go home. I did not know, standing in that sitting room with its fire and its family and Serena's careful architecture of welcome, that the evening was about to become something none of us, not Elliot, not Serena, not Vincent Vance with his sharp eyes and his unshakable certainty, had prepared for. I did not know that in approximately 2 hours, this room full of people who had already decided who I was would be forced to decide again. I did not know that the front doors of this house were about to open, and that when they did, everything Elliot Vance had ever believed about the woman he left behind would shatter so completely that he would spend the rest of the evening collecting the pieces with his bare hands. I stood in that sitting room with my water glass and my quiet dress and my 2 years of very careful, very deliberate work. And I waited for dinner to be called. The table, as it turned out, was already set. If this story has already got you feeling something, drop a comment right now. Tell me you're watching. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it before the next chapter, because what Serena does at that Thanksgiving table, and what walks through those front doors, is exactly why this channel exists. Stay with me. The dining room table was long enough to seat 14 and set with the kind of care that announces itself. Pressed linen, polished silver, the low arrangement of autumn flowers that Serena had clearly chosen because they coordinated with her dress. I noticed the seating cards as we filed in. Small ivory rectangles, the names written in a hand I didn't recognize. Mine was mid-table. Not at the end near the kitchen where you put people you've forgotten. Not near Eleanor at the head. Squarely in the center, flanked on both sides by people I barely knew, Elliot's second cousin and her husband, a man named Gerald who immediately told me about his golf handicap. Visible from every seat at the table, isolated from the people who might have anchored me. Serena had arranged this. I recognized the geometry of it. I had seen it before in boardrooms and conference calls, the strategic placement of the person you want to seem like the least important one in the room. You put them where everyone can see them but no one is responsible for them. You make them visible and peripheral at the same time. It was, I had to admit, expertly done. I sat down, unfolded my napkin and placed it in my lap. The wine was poured. A good Burgundy, which told me Vincent had chosen it and not Serena, because Serena would have chosen something that photographed better. The first course arrived. A delicate squash bisque with a swirl of cream, served in the wide shallow bowls Eleanor had bought in Tuscany the year Elliot and I got married. I remembered those bowls. I focused on my soup. The conversation assembled itself around me the way it always did in rooms where I was the person who required managing. Loud at both ends of the table, specific and excluding in the middle, moving across me like weather. Freddie held court near Vincent about the property market. Philippa, Elliot's sister, asked Serena about a trip they were apparently planning to Positano. Elliot contributed at intervals, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man at a table he had inherited. And then Marguerite, from 3 seats down, asked the question that had been circling the room since I walked in. "So, Prudence," she said with the bright attentiveness of someone picking up an object to see how heavy it is, "what are you up to these days?" The table didn't stop. But it quieted, the specific quieting of people rearranging their attention without wanting to show it. Before I could answer, Serena turned from her conversation with Philippa and smiled across the table at me with the warmth of a lighthouse. Bright, directional, impossible to ignore. "Oh, she's been finding herself," Serena said. The tone was fond. Admiring almost. "Haven't you, Prudence? After everything, that takes real courage. Not everyone can just restart like that." "Restart," Marguerite repeated, nodding slowly like this confirmed something. "It's admirable," Serena continued, reaching for her wine glass. "Truly. Not everyone needs a big career to feel fulfilled. Some people just need time." She said it the way you say something kind about a child's drawing. I set down my soup spoon. Not because I was upset. I set it down because I was making a decision, the kind you make very quietly, in the part of yourself that has been waiting a long time for the right moment to stop being patient. Elliot was looking at his wine glass. He hadn't corrected her. He hadn't even shifted in his chair. He sat there with his burgundy and his inheritance and his fiancée in ivory, and he let the sentence hang in the air over the table like a verdict he'd already signed. I picked up my spoon again. "I'm in risk management," I said. "Purry." Without elaboration. Among other things. Serena made a small sound, delighted, musical, the sound of someone who has heard an answer they expected. "How practical," she said. 1 or 2 people near me found something to examine in their soup bowls. I noted who they were. I noted everything. Outside the dining room windows, the November dark pressed against the glass, and somewhere beyond the warmth of this table and these candles and this carefully arranged evening, a black car was moving through the city. I didn't know that yet. I only knew that the bisque was good, that Serena's smile hadn't reached her eyes in the last 40 minutes, and that I had survived harder rooms than this one by doing exactly what I was doing now. Staying still. Staying quiet. Waiting. Don't go anywhere. What happens next, I promise you, is the reason this story exists. Subscribe if you haven't. And stay. Right there. The main course arrived and Serena sharpened her edge. It happened the way the most effective cruelties always happen. Gradually, then all at once, wrapped in the language of concern so that by the time you felt the blade you were already expected to be grateful for the attention. The turkey had been carved and served, the sides passed around the table in their good ceramic dishes. Roasted root vegetables, a cranberry relish, the cornbread stuffing Eleanor made every year from a recipe that predated everyone at this table. The room had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a family meal. Conversations overlapping, the wine doing its work, the candles burning lower. Then Vincent Vance from the head of the table looked directly at me. "Prudence." His voice carried the particular authority of a man who had spent 40 years being listened to and had long since stopped distinguishing between that and being right. "Tell me what you're doing with yourself these days. Elliot mentioned you'd made some changes." The table shifted its attention. I set down my fork calmly. "I work in risk management and strategic acquisition consulting. I advise several firms across different sectors." "Risk management," Vincent repeated, in the tone of a man filing information in a folder marked unverified. "Which firms?" "I keep my client list private," I said. "Confidentiality is part of what they pay for." Something moved behind Vincent's eyes. Not quite respect, but the reconsideration that precedes it. And then Serena set down her own fork. "She's being modest." Her voice was warm, generous, the voice of someone doing you a favor. Elliot always said Prudence had such a gift for the smaller details. The behind-the-scenes work. She smiled across the table at me. "Not everyone is built for the front lines and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The support roles are just as important." The words landed exactly where she aimed them. Support roles. Behind the scenes. Smaller details. I heard Philippa murmur something to her husband that I didn't catch but understood by the small curve of his mouth. Marguerite nodded into her wine glass with the satisfaction of someone whose private assessment had just been publicly confirmed. Elliot looked at the centerpiece. I picked up my fork. "You're right," I said pleasantly, cutting into my turkey. "The behind-the-scenes work is underrated." I let it sit there. Agreement on the surface, something entirely different underneath. And I watched Serena decide in real time whether I'd just conceded or outmaneuvered her. She wasn't certain. That uncertainty was the first crack in her evening. But she recovered quickly. "I think it's wonderful," she continued, reaching over to rest her hand briefly on Elliot's arm. "A gesture for the table, not for him, that you found your footing. Divorce is so destabilizing. Some people never really come back from it. Some people," I agreed, "don't." The table absorbed this. Gerald's wife, beside me, made a small sympathetic sound that I did not acknowledge. And then Serena did something that told me everything I needed to know about exactly how frightened she was underneath all that ivory and rehearsed warmth. She pushed further. "I've actually been reading about the consulting industry lately," she said, to the table rather than to me, "the way a prosecutor addresses the jury rather than the witness. It's fascinating how many people move into that space after a career transition. It's quite accessible now. There are even online certification programs." She tilted her head at me with bright, lethal interest. "Is that the route you took?" The table went quiet. Gerald had stopped chewing. I looked at Serena across the candles and the cranberry relish and 2 years of a silence she had clearly mistaken for absence, and I felt something settle in my chest, cool and certain and entirely without heat. "No," I said simply. "It isn't." I lifted my wine glass, took one measured sip, and turned to ask Eleanor about the cornbread recipe, and I did not look at Serena again for the rest of the course. Let her wonder. Let her sit in the uncertainty of a woman who had thrown everything she had at a target that hadn't moved. Outside, somewhere in the dark city beyond these warm windows, a black car was navigating through Thanksgiving traffic. I didn't know that yet. I only knew that my hands were steady, my breathing was even, and I had survived the first cut exactly the way I had survived every cut before it. By refusing to bleed where they could see. The front doors opened without a knock. I felt it before I heard it. A change in the quality of the air, the way a room's atmosphere shifts when something with genuine weight enters it. The candles near the entrance corridor flickered. A draft moved through the dining room, cool and sudden. And then the room went still. Not quiet, still. The specific stillness that belongs to a group of people whose bodies have all registered the same thing at the same time before their minds have caught up. Someone stopped mid-sentence. Someone else set down a glass. Marguerite turned in her chair toward the doorway, and I watched the expression on her face move through 3 distinct stages. Curiosity, confusion, and something that was the social equivalent of vertigo. I turned last. He stood in the entrance to the dining room. Rafael Veti. 6'2" in a dark suit that had been made for him by someone who understood the architecture of authority. Silver threaded through dark hair at his temples. A face that had never learned to perform ease because ease was not something he required. His hands were loose at his sides, relaxed, unhurried, and his eyes, dark and completely without urgency, moved across the room once. And stopped on me. He didn't scan. He didn't search. He looked at me the way you look at the one fixed point in a room full of motion, and then he moved. Through the doorway. Around the edge of the table. Past Vance's shoulder, past Serena's open, perfect mouth, past Elliot, who had pushed his chair back from the table by several inches without appearing to notice he'd done it. And he came toward me with the absolute certainty of a man who has never once been stopped by anything. The room watched him come. I watched him come. He stopped beside my chair and the world contracted to approximately 12 inches of space. Both hands came up, steady, certain, entirely without performance. And he cupped my face the way you handle something you have carried a long way and have no intention of setting down. His forehead came to rest against mine, and for one suspended moment the dining room, the candles, the Vance family and all their carefully constructed opinions ceased to exist. "Cara mia," he said, low and private, his accent moving through the Italian the way water moves through familiar channels. Then he straightened, turned to the table and said it again in English. "My wife." 2 words. Serena's wine glass connected with the table. Someone across from me, I didn't look to see who, exhaled in a way that was almost a word. Marguerite's hand went to her collar. Gerald's fork was suspended halfway to his mouth, forgotten. And Elliot, who had spent 4 years teaching me that I was too quiet, too careful, too unspectacular for the life he was building. Elliot sat in his chair at his family's Thanksgiving table and went the color of good parchment. Rafael pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat. His movements were unhurried, precise, the movements of a man who had never once needed to announce himself because rooms announced themselves around him. He picked up the unused napkin, placed it in his lap and looked at my barely touched plate. "You haven't eaten," he said. "I wasn't hungry." "You're always hungry." His eyes found mine and there was something there, private, warm, the particular warmth of a man who has paid very close attention for a very long time. "I'll have them bring something else. The food is fine." "Then eat." It was the most ordinary exchange in the world. It was the most devastating thing that had happened at that table all evening. Because Elliot was watching it. He was watching the way Rafael's attention returned to me, the way a compass returns to north. Not possessive, not performative, just inevitable, like something that could not be trained in a different direction. He was watching the way I leaned, almost imperceptibly, the half-inch toward Rafael that a body allows itself only in the presence of someone it trusts completely. He was watching something he had never once bothered to build. Vincent Vance cleared his throat from the head of the table, the sound of a powerful man remembering that he was one. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said. Rafael looked at him. "No," he agreed pleasantly. "You haven't." The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to make its point. Then Rafael reached for my water glass, checked it, and turned to the nearest person with the air of someone who was going to request more without raising his voice because he had never needed to raise his voice in his life. And the room collectively remembered how to breathe. The table tried to reassemble itself. It took a few minutes. The social equivalent of picking up broken china and determining which pieces were still usable. Conversations restarted at both ends, tentative at first, gathering confidence. Someone asked someone else something about the cranberry relish. Gerald, bless him, resumed a story about a golf course he had been telling before the world rearranged itself. But the center of the table did not recover. The center of the table watched us. Not openly, these were people trained in the art of watching without appearing to, but I felt it, the way you feel a room's attention even when no one is looking directly at you. I had been the object of this table's private assessments all evening. Now I was something different. Now I was a question they didn't know how to formulate. Rafael was speaking quietly to the server who had appeared at his shoulder. Something about the wine, a preference for a specific vintage, mentioned with the ease of a man who had long since stopped distinguishing between what he preferred and what would materialize. The server nodded and disappeared. Then Rafael turned to me. "Are you all right?" "Oh, private. For no one but me." "I'm fine." He looked at me for a moment. "You're not fine." "I'm managing." "There's a difference." "I know there's a difference." I said I'm managing. The corner of his mouth moved. Barely, just the suggestion of something wry. "That's my girl." And there was that phrase, said in exactly that tone. Not possessive, not patronizing, just settled, the way you speak to someone whose rhythms you know so well that comfort has become its own language. I felt something in my chest shift and resettle, the way a weight redistributes when you finally set it down on a surface that can hold it. Elliot was 3 seats away. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I could feel the quality of his attention the way you feel weather. Not by looking at the sky but by what it does to the air around you. He was watching us with the expression of a man trying to solve an equation that keeps producing an answer he doesn't recognize. He was watching the way Rafael's body angled toward mine. He was watching the way I didn't shrink. When we were married I had shrunk. I hadn't known I was doing it. That was the insidious thing about it, the gradual accommodation, the slow adjustment of your posture to fit someone else's ceiling. You don't notice until the ceiling is gone and you realize you've forgotten how to stand at your full height. Rafael had never once asked me to lower my ceiling. He had in fact found the ceiling in the first place and said, in that quiet, irrefutable way of his, "This is not the top. Go higher." Philippa's husband, a man named Tristan who had said very little all evening, leaned forward across the table with the careful interest of someone who has decided the risk is worth it. "So," he said, addressing Rafael with the tone of a man trying to sound casual, "how did you two meet?" Rafael reached for his newly arrived wine, considered the glass, and then looked at me in the way he always did when he was going to let me choose what version of a story to tell. "A conference," I said. "In Boston." "She was presenting," Rafael said. I was in the audience. He set his glass down. I stayed for every session. He pretended it was about the subject matter, I said. It was entirely about the subject matter. Pause. You happen to be the subject matter. It was an old exchange, familiar in the way of things that have been said enough times to become their own kind of intimacy. Tristan smiled. Even Philippa, who had spent most of the evening at the Serena end of the table, looked up with something that was almost unguarded interest. Serena was very still in her ivory dress. She had the expression of a woman watching a performance she had not been told was happening, trying to determine whether it was rehearsed and coming to the slow, uncomfortable conclusion that it was not. That was the thing about what Rafael and I had. It could not be performed because it had never been designed for an audience. It had been built in private, in the margins, in early mornings and late nights, and the particular silence of two people who understood that they did not need to fill every quiet with noise. Elliot had needed noise. Elliot had needed me to be bright and easy and uncomplicated, to laugh at the right moments and defer at the right moments and want the things that made sense in the context of the life he was building. I had tried. For 4 years I had tried. And Rafael had sat across from me at a hotel bar in Boston after a conference that had gone 3 hours over schedule, and he had asked me about my work. Really asked with the specific, unhurried attention of a man who wanted the actual answer rather than the manageable version, and I had talked for 45 minutes without once monitoring myself. That was the night I understood what it felt like to take up the right amount of space. I reached for my own wine glass. Across the table, Elliot looked at his plate. He had, I realized, barely eaten a thing. Vincent Vance had built his fortune reading rooms. 40 years in East Coast real estate had given him the ability to assess value quickly, to identify what was load-bearing and what was decorative, to recognize the difference between the appearance of substance and the thing itself. It was the skill that had made him wealthy and the vanity that had made him certain. Certain that he read people as well as he read property, certain that his assessments were reliable, certain that the woman his son had married and then discarded had been, as Elliot always implied, a comfortable but ultimately insufficient investment. He had been certain of this all evening. Now he was leaning forward from the head of the table with the expression of a man whose foundation has developed a crack he cannot locate. "Forgive me," he said to Rafael, with the careful courtesy of someone who has decided that care is suddenly warranted. "I didn't catch your surname." Rafael was cutting into the turkey he had been brought. Methodical, unhurried, each movement exact in the way of a man who does not waste motion. He looked up at Vincent with the polite attention he might give a newspaper. "Veti," he said. The name landed. I watched it happen across Vincent's face. The recognition arriving in stages, the way a light comes on in a large house, room by room. First the name itself. Then the context. Then the implications of the context. Then what the implications of the implications meant for every assumption he had made about the woman sitting 3 seats from his son. Someone else at the table reached for their phone and then appeared to remember that reaching for a phone was not something one did at Vincent Vance's Thanksgiving table and put it back. Marguerite looked at Rafael, then at me, then at Rafael again, with the expression of a woman rapidly revising a document she thought was already final. Serena's smile was still in place. But something behind it had changed. Some small structural element, some load-bearing assumption, and the smile was now doing work it had not previously been required to do. Holding something up that had, until 60 seconds ago, been holding itself. "Rafael Veturi," Vincent said as though testing the weight of it. "Yes. Of the Veturi group. Among other things." The "among other things" landed softly and with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding that the most effective statements are the ones that require the listener to do the arithmetic themselves. Vincent Vance did the arithmetic. I watched him do it behind his eyes, the rapid practiced calculation of a man who understood scale. The Veturi portfolio. 14 countries. A network of legitimate holdings, luxury development, private equity, maritime logistics, that had been built over 3 generations into something that made the Vance family's considerable fortune look like a footnote. And underneath all of that, the other thing. The thing that was never discussed in quarterly reports but was understood by anyone who operated at sufficient altitude. The Veturi name was old. The Veturi reach was older. And the Calabrian roots that had seeded both were older still, going back to soil and silence and the particular code of men who settled their accounts in private. Politicians returned Rafael's calls within the hour. Federal prosecutors played careful golf on the right weekends. And Vincent Vance, who had spent his entire career believing he sat at the top of every room he entered, was very quietly discovering that he had been wrong. I wasn't aware, Vincent said to no one in particular, that you were married. We keep our private life private, Rafael said pleasantly. My wife prefers it. He reached over and poured a small additional measure of wine into my glass without being asked, the gesture so natural it was almost invisible. Though I begin to think privacy has its limits. And then he turned to me. Prudence. Even the way he said my name was different from how anyone else at this table said it. Not clipped, not careful, not freighted with the subtext of someone who had already decided what it meant. Just my name given back to me clean. Didn't you review a real estate restructuring proposal last month? The one in the northeastern portfolio. I had. And I understood exactly what he was doing and exactly why, and I felt 2 years of quiet work settle in my chest like ballast. I did, I said. What was your assessment? I could have deflected. I could have kept playing the private, uncomplicated woman who had come to this dinner for Eleanor's sake and wanted nothing more than to get through the evening with her dignity intact. But Serena's voice was still in my ears. Support roles. Behind the scenes. Not everyone is built for the front lines. And Elliot had said nothing. I set down my fork. Flawed capital structure, I said clearly, to the table rather than to Rafael, because the table was the audience that needed to hear it. The debt-to-equity ratio assumed market conditions from 18 months ago that no longer exist. The projected returns were optimistic by approximately 30%. I paused. I recommended against the full acquisition. We negotiated a modified entry position instead, which has since outperformed the original projection by 11 points. The table was very quiet. Vincent Vance was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in 4 years of dinners at this table. He was looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Prudence, Rafael said with the quiet satisfaction of a man who already knew the answer, has been the silent architecture behind 3 of our most significant European acquisitions in the past 18 months. He let that settle, then added, her instincts on risk have not been wrong once. Not once, I confirmed. Serena had not moved. Her wine glass was in her hand and she had not moved, and the smile was still there, but it had become something different now. It had become the expression of a woman standing in a room she had very carefully arranged, realizing that the furniture has all been moved while she was looking somewhere else. Elliot raised his eyes from his plate. He looked at me. And I looked back, not with triumph, not with the heat of 2 years of accumulated indignation finally given air, but with something quieter and more permanent than any of those things. I looked at him with the simple, settled certainty of a woman who knew exactly who she was. And I picked up my fork and I finished my dinner. The table had stopped performing. That was the thing I noticed first. The absence of performance. The careful social architecture that Serena had constructed over the course of the evening, brick by deliberate brick, had come apart somewhere between Rafael's arrival and the moment Vincent Vance had gone quiet. And what was left was just people, sitting around a table with their wine and their recalibrated assumptions and the particular discomfort of being wrong in a room where they had been very certain they were right. Gerald was looking at me with open curiosity and no attempt to conceal it. Marguerite had set down her glass. Philippa's husband Tristan had turned his chair slightly, almost imperceptible, probably unconscious, so that he was angled more toward me than toward Serena. And Elliot. Elliot was looking at the tablecloth. He had been looking at the tablecloth for approximately 4 minutes, which I knew because I had been watching, the way you watch something you have already decided not to touch but cannot quite stop observing. It was Marguerite who broke the quiet. 36% growth, she said, half to herself, reviewing the number the way someone reviews a figure they should have known about earlier. 40, Rafael corrected without looking up from his plate. Year over year. The 36 was the conservative projection. Marguerite looked at me. And you, she started again. You've been doing this for how long? The consulting work. 2 years. I kept my voice even, the way I kept everything even these days. I started small. Single clients, specific projects. It expanded. You were always methodical, Eleanor said from her end of the table, in the tone of someone confirming a long-held position. I always said that. She had. I remembered it now. Eleanor saying it across this same table years ago, and Elliot making a small sound beside me that I had chosen at the time to interpret as agreement rather than the dismissal it probably was. Elliot looked up from the tablecloth. He looked at me with an expression I could not fully categorize. Not guilt, because guilt requires acknowledgement and acknowledgement requires honesty, and I was not certain Elliot had ever been fully honest about the real reason he left. Not anger, because anger would have required him to believe he'd been wronged, and some part of him I could see, understood that the wrongdoing in our marriage had not been evenly distributed. Something older and rawer than either of those things. Something closer to the specific grief of a man who has discarded something valuable and is now watching it appreciate. He never told me, he said. His voice was quiet. Not quite an accusation. Not quite anything, actually, just words arranged in the shape of a sentence, reaching toward something they couldn't quite grasp. When we were together I didn't know you were. I was learning, I said simply. The table held its breath. I was always learning, Elliot. I was careful and I was quiet and I was building something. Slowly, the way I do everything, because I don't move fast and I don't move loud. That's not a flaw. It's a method. I set my fork down, not with emphasis, just with finality. You told me I thought too small. You told me I'd never make real money being cautious. You told me, and here my voice remained level, because I had rehearsed nothing but I had also lived this for 2 years and the living had made me precise, that I was too simple for the life you were building. Elliot said nothing. I was quiet, I continued. I still am. But quiet isn't empty. I looked at him across the candles and the autumn flowers and the ruins of an evening that had been designed to make me feel small. You weren't losing a simple woman, Elliot. You were leaving a woman you hadn't learned how to read yet. That's not the same thing. And that was never my flaw. It was yours. The room was entirely still. Even the candles seemed to pause. Serena's expression was the carefully controlled blankness of a woman who has realized the evening has moved entirely outside her management and is deciding whether to attempt recovery or minimize losses. She was smart enough, I thought, to be choosing the latter. Vance was looking at his son with the particular expression of a father who has a question he is not going to ask at the dinner table. Eleanor had both hands wrapped around her wine glass and she was watching me with eyes that were doing something around the edges that I chose not to look at directly. Because if I looked at Eleanor looking at me like that, something in my chest was going to come apart, and I had not come this far to come apart at this table. Rafael's hand found mine under the tablecloth. He didn't squeeze. He didn't say anything. He simply placed his hand over mine, steady, certain, warm, the way you put a hand on something to tell it that it is not, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, alone. Elliot looked at our hands. He looked at them for a long moment, with an expression that would have taken me 4 years to read when we were married but that I could read now, clearly, from across a Thanksgiving table in November light. He was looking at what it cost him not to have been paying attention. I made a mistake, he said. You made a choice, I said. So did I. We both have to live with them. I picked up my wine glass. But only one of us, I said, is living well. Eleanor stood up slowly. She rose the way she did everything. Without announcement, without waiting for a pause in conversation to insert herself, simply standing and allowing her presence to be the pause. At 72, Eleanor Vance was the most quietly powerful person in any room she entered, and it had taken me until tonight to understand that I had learned something from watching her do it. She lifted her wine glass. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, from something else, from the weight of a moment she had been waiting for longer than anyone at this table knew. I'd like to say something, she said. The table settled. Vincent looked at his wife with the expression he always wore when Eleanor was about to say something he hadn't pre-approved. Wary, respectful, aware from 4 decades of marriage that the wisest position was to listen. I have sat at this table for 43 Thanksgiving dinners, Eleanor said. I have watched this family grow and change and make choices. Some good ones and some, a brief pause measured, less good. She did not look at Elliot. She didn't need to. I would like to propose a toast. Not to the holiday. Not to the year. She turned, and her eyes found mine across the length of the table, across the candles and the silverware and the quiet wreckage of Serena's carefully planned evening. To the women at this table who carry more than anyone gives them credit for. Who build in silence. Who remain standing when the room would prefer them not to. She raised her glass toward me. To Prudence. The response was not unanimous. But it was enough. Tristan raised his glass first, then Philippa, surprising me, then Gerald enthusiastically because Gerald had spent most of the evening looking for something to feel good about and had apparently decided this was it. Freddie, after a moment, raised his glass from the far end of the table with the look of a man who understands belatedly which side of history he would prefer to be on. Marguerite raised hers. Serena raised hers precisely a beat too late, the interval of a woman making a calculation, and when she did, her smile was back in place and perfectly assembled and absolutely hollow. Elliot did not raise his glass. He sat with his hands on the table, looking at the stem of his wine glass, and he did not raise it. And that was, I thought, the most honest thing he had done all evening. I raised my water glass to Eleanor. "Thank you," I said. Just that. 2 words, which was enough. The dinner wound down the way dinners do when the real event of the evening has already occurred. Gradually, with a certain deflation of energy, guests remembering that they had drive times and early mornings and reasons to be elsewhere. Coats were retrieved. Arrangements were made. Serena, I noticed, was very warm and very efficient in her goodbyes, moving through the room with the precise social energy of a woman converting an evening she had lost into a graceful exit. I said my goodbye to Eleanor in the hallway near the stairs, and it was long and quiet, and everything that needed to be said was said without any of the words being the ones we actually used. "Come for Christmas," she said, holding my hands. "I'll call you." "Firm. You'll answer." I almost smiled. "Yes, I'll answer." She held my gaze for one more moment, and then she let me go, and I turned toward the coat rack for my things. That was when Elliot appeared. He came from the side hallway, moving with the deliberate lack of hurry of a man who has been waiting for this moment and is now uncertain what to do with it. He stopped a few feet away. He looked older than he had at the beginning of the evening. Not by years, by something else. By the specific aging that happens when a version of yourself you've been protecting turns out to be inaccurate. "Prudence." I held my coat in both hands and waited. "I didn't know," he said. "About any of it. The work that I didn't know about him." "Oh," I agreed. "I thought." He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it was briefly painful. "When we divorced, I thought you'd struggle. I thought you needed." "You thought I needed you," I said gently enough. "I know." He looked at the floor. "Didn't you?" I considered this honestly, the way I had tried to consider most things honestly since the day I decided that honesty was the only currency I could actually afford. "For about 3 months," I said. "I missed you. I missed what I thought we were." I folded my coat over my arm. And then I remembered who I was before I spent 4 years trying to be what your version of us required. I looked at him, at this man I had loved and cooked Sunday dinners for, and rearranged myself around and finally let go. "You didn't leave me because I wasn't enough, Elliot. I want you to understand that. You left because you couldn't see me clearly, and that's not something I could have fixed by being any different than I was." He was quiet for a long moment. "He sees you," he said finally. Flat. Not bitter. Something more complicated than bitter. Vituri. "He sees you." "Yes," I said. "He does." A silence. "I should have." "He didn't," I said. "Neither of us can change that." So, I put on my coat. I looked at him one last time. This man who had been the first chapter of a story that had turned out to be much longer and more interesting than either of us expected. "I hope the project finds funding, Elliot," I said. "I genuinely do." And I meant it. I walked back toward the dining room entrance where Rafael was waiting, unhurried, hands in his pockets, watching me come toward him with the expression of a man who has never once been uncertain about what he is waiting for. I didn't look back. November had sharpened while we were inside. The air hit my face the moment we stepped through the front doors, clean and cold, carrying the smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the street and the faraway scent of fallen leaves. After 3 hours inside the Vance estate's warmth and candlelight and the specific suffocating weight of rooms full of people who have made up their minds about you, the cold felt like honesty. I breathed it in. Rafael's car was already at the foot of the steps. Black, quiet, entirely without ostentation. The kind of vehicle chosen by someone who understood that the most serious power never announces itself. The driver stood at a distance, hands clasped, looking at nothing in the trained way of people in Rafael's orbit who had learned that seeing less was seeing more. We walked down the stone steps together. Our footsteps on the stone. The sound of the door closing behind us. The muffled warmth of the house receding. Rafael opened my door. I got in. The seat was warm. He had called ahead, I knew, because he always did, because he had never once in the entire time I had known him made me sit in a cold car. It was such a small thing. It was such an enormous thing. He walked around the front. Got in. Closed his door. He didn't start the engine. He sat with his hands on the wheel and looked through the windscreen at the Vance estate, still glowing with amber light, still full of people working through what the evening had required of them. Then he turned and looked at me. In the dim interior light, just the glow from the dashboard, just the borrowed light from the house and the street lamps, he looked the way he always looked when it was only us. Not the version of Rafael Veti that rooms recalibrated themselves around. Not the version that made Vance do quiet arithmetic at his own dinner table. Just the man who had bought me coffee in a hotel bar in Boston and asked about my work like the answer actually mattered. You didn't have to come tonight, I said. No. I wasn't expecting you. I told you not to. You told me not to come out of obligation. He said it the way he said most things. Quiet, final, without room for argument. I didn't come out of obligation. I looked at my hands in my lap. It was a difficult evening. Yes. You made it more difficult. Did I? You know you did. I looked up at him. When you walked into that room. When I walked into that room, he said you had been sitting at a table full of people telling you for 3 hours, a story about yourself that was not true. And you were being too polite to correct it. His eyes held mine without any give. I corrected it. You corrected it by walking in like what? I stopped. Like the most dangerous man in any room he'd ever entered. Like a man who had crossed 14 countries and built an empire and navigated waters that would have sunk anyone with a weaker stomach, and had still somehow found the most important thing he'd ever encountered in a Boston hotel bar at 11 o'clock at night talking about microinvestment strategies. Like yourself, I said. Something shifted in his face. That movement, small and rare, that was Rafael's equivalent of anyone else's full smile. You built something, he said. In the time before I knew you and in the time since. You built it alone and you built it well. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his hand briefly warm against my cheek. That room needed to know that. You needed to stop being the only person in it who knew that. My throat tightened. Eleanor's toast, I said, and my voice did something I hadn't given it permission to do. I know. I wasn't going to, I stopped. Pressed my lips together. I know, he said again, softer. Outside, the amber windows of the Vance estate threw their warm light across the stone steps where I had stood 2 hours ago, smoothing a dress I had chosen to give them as little as possible to work with. I watched the light for a moment. I thought about all the versions of myself that had moved through those rooms. The woman who had cooked Sunday dinners in that kitchen, the woman who had walked those hallways telling herself she was enough, the woman who had left 2 years ago and quietly, without audience, without anyone watching, become someone she could actually recognize. The windows of the Vance estate grew smaller in the side mirror. I didn't watch them go. I turned toward the windscreen and the open road ahead and the city unwinding its lights into the distance, and I felt, not victorious, not vindicated, not any of the things I had quietly feared I would need to feel to make the evening worth having survived. I felt free. Not the dramatic freedom of someone escaping something. The quiet, permanent freedom of a woman who has finally stopped waiting for the room to change its mind about her. Rafael started the engine. The car pulled away from the curb, smooth and unhurried the way he did everything. Next time Eleanor calls, he said after a few minutes of comfortable silence, I'm coming with you from the beginning. She'll love that. I know she will. Pause. I didn't argue. We drove through the November city, lights blurring past the window, the road ahead open, the Vance estate and Elliot's unraised glass and Serena's reassembled smile all receding into the particular irrelevance of things that have already happened and cannot reach you anymore. He had left me 2 years ago because he said I was too quiet for his world. I had not argued. I had simply gone very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that builds things, the kind that accumulates, the kind that does not announce itself until the room is already full of what it made. Some women need a powerful man to remind a room who they are. I just needed one who had never once forgotten. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something at that table, if Eleanor's toast hit somewhere real, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There are more women like Prudence in these stories. More rooms like that one. More moments where the quiet ones finally take up exactly the space they were always meant to fill. We'll be here. Don't miss it.